Welcome to Cafe Tales, The Raven Who Brought the Death List. Tonight's story begins. But before we dive in, thank you for being here with us. I'm your host, Ailey, and isn't it wonderful how these mysteries bring us together from all corners of the world? Leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe for new stories every day. Now, let's begin the mystery. Chapter 1. The Bird on the Lich Gate. The late October morning had that peculiar quality of light that comes just before winter settles properly over the English countryside. Miss Jane Marple pulled her knitted shawl closer about her shoulders as she and Lady Bantry made their way along the familiar path from the vicarage, their footsteps crisp on the fallen leaves that carpeted the churchyard. Approach. Really, Jane? Lady Bantry was saying, her breath forming small puffs in the chilly air. I do think Mrs. Clement's idea of charging 6 pence for a slice of seed cake is rather ambitious. After all, it's not as though her baking has improved. Since last year's harvest festival, Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled with gentle amusement. Perhaps, my dear Dolly, but one must consider that flour has gone up considerably, and Mrs. Clement does put her heart into the church fund. Though I confess I did notice she used rather too much caraway this time. They had reached the Lich Gate now, that ancient wooden structure that had guarded the entrance to St. Mary Mead's churchyard for centuries. The old timber post stood weathered but sturdy, supporting the traditional peaked roof that sheltered those who paused to rest on the bench beneath. It was then that Miss Marple's attention was caught by something altogether extraordinary. Perched upon the crossbeam of the Lich Gate was a raven of quite remarkable proportions. The bird was glossy black, its feathers gleaming with an almost metallic sheen in the pale morning light. It seemed entirely at ease, as though it had every right to occupy that particular spot, and it regarded the two ladies with bright, intelligent eyes that held no trace of fear. "Good heavens," murmured Lady Bantry, stopping short. "Would you look at the size of that creature?" The raven tilted its head, considering them with what appeared to be sardonic interest. Then, quite suddenly, it opened its beak and emitted a single harsh croak that seemed to echo through the quiet morning air with surprising resonance. Miss Marple found herself studying the bird with the same careful attention she might give to an unexpected guest at a tea party. There was something about its demeanor, something almost theatrical in the way it sat so perfectly positioned, so clearly visible to anyone approaching the church. "Shoo!" Lady Bantry called, waving her gloved hand. "Go on, you great black thing!" But the raven showed no inclination to be shooed. Instead, with what seemed like deliberate ceremony, it spread its magnificent wings, gave another croaking call, and launched itself into the air. The powerful wing beats carried it up and over the church tower, where it disappeared from view with a sort of dramatic exit that would not have been out of place on the London stage. "Well, I never," said Lady Bantry, watching its departure. "Extraordinary behavior for a wild bird. They usually have the sense to avoid people." Miss Marple, however, had already turned her attention to the bench beneath the Lich Gate. There, placed with almost conspicuous precision in the center of the weathered wood, lay an envelope. It was cream-colored and of good quality, with a border of black edging that gave it a distinctly funereal appearance. "Dolly," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note that made Lady Bantry look at her sharply. "I think we should fetch the Reverend." Lady Bantry followed her gaze to the envelope. "Someone's dropped their post, I suppose, though it's rather odd, isn't it? I mean, who carries letters about the churchyard at this hour of the morning?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is precisely what troubles me. They found the Reverend Leonard Clement in the vestry, where he was arranging the altar flowers with the sort of careful attention that suggested his mind was on weightier matters than chrysanthemums. He was a tall, thin man with prematurely graying hair and the gentle scholarly air that seemed natural to country clergymen who had spent their lives tending to both souls and parish accounts. "Miss Marple, Lady Bantry," he greeted them with a smile. "I hope you found the committee meeting satisfactory." Mrs. Clement was quite pleased with the arrangements for the cake stall. "Leonard," said Miss Marple, "I'm afraid we've discovered something rather unusual at the Lich Gate. An envelope. Placed there, I believe, quite deliberately." The Reverend's eyebrows rose. "An envelope? But surely," Lady Bantry interrupted, "there was a raven, a great black creature sitting right on the crossbeam, as bold as you please. The moment it saw us, it flew away, leaving that envelope behind." Reverend Clement looked from one lady to the other with the expression of a man who was not entirely certain whether he was being presented with fact or fancy. "A raven, you say? How very unusual. We don't often see ravens in St. Mary Mead. The occasional crow, of course. But I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that we should look at the envelope before speculating further." They made their way back to the Lich Gate, where Ephraim Potley, the church verger, had appeared as if summoned by some mysterious parish telegraph. He was a small, wiry man of indeterminate age, with a sort of permanently worried expression that comes from a lifetime of tending to church property and the countless small crises that arise in village life. "Morning, Reverend," he said, touching his cap. "Funny thing this morning. Could have sworn I heard a bird making an uncommon racket near the gate. Came to have a look, but there's nothing here except—" His eyes fell upon the envelope. "Well, now, that wasn't here when I passed at 6. Reverend Clement approached the envelope with the caution of a man who had learned through long experience in parish work that apparently innocent objects could sometimes conceal considerable complications. He picked it up carefully, noting its weight and texture. "Good quality paper," he observed. "And this black border, it suggests morning stationery." "The flap isn't sealed," Miss Marple noted, her sharp eyes taking in details that others might miss. "And there's something rather odd about it. Look there, at the edge of the flap, that tiny round hole. Indeed, there was a small, perfectly circular hole pierced through the paper near the point of the flap, as though it had been made by a pin or tack." "Perhaps," suggested Lady Bantry, "we should see what's inside before we puzzle over holes and ravens." Reverend Clement opened the envelope with careful fingers and drew out a single sheet of paper. The typing was neat and clear, executed on what appeared to be a standard office typewriter. There was no letterhead, no date, no signature, only a simple list of 5 names typed in black ink. Miss Phyllis Trentmister, Osric Fielding, Mrs. Ivy Priestaframe, Potlatilda Briggs. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Ephraim Potley had gone quite pale upon hearing his own name read aloud, and Lady Bantry's expression had shifted from curiosity to something approaching alarm. "But those are all village people," she said unnecessarily. "Miss Trent, the retired schoolmistress, Mr. Fielding from Old Quarry Lane, Ivy from the post office, Ephraim here, and my own Tilda." "A list of names," said Reverend Clement slowly, "delivered by a raven. How very biblical. Though I confess I cannot recall any scriptural precedent that would make this a comforting discovery." Mrs. Clement, who had appeared from the direction of the vicarage with the sort of timing that suggested she had been watching from the windows, crossed herself with visible fervor. "It's like something out of the Old Testament," she murmured. "Ravens carrying messages of doom. Nasty theater." "If you ask me," said Lady Bantry crisply, "someone's idea of a practical joke. though I can't imagine what they hope to accomplish by frightening half the village. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had been conducting her own quiet examination of the scene. She knelt beside the lich gate post, her keen eyes studying the weathered wood with the sort of methodical attention that had on more than one occasion proved invaluable in matters of considerably greater complexity than apparent practical jokes. "How curious," she murmured almost to herself. "There are smears here on the post, rather greasy smears, and with a distinctive smell." She held up a gloved finger for the others to examine. "Suet, I believe. The sort one might use to feed birds." "You think someone was feeding that raven?" asked Reverend Clement. "More than that, I think." Miss Marple rose and brushed off her skirt. "I think someone wanted to ensure that the raven would be here at precisely the right moment to provide a suitable dramatic effect." She moved to the gravel path beneath the lich gate and, after a moment's careful searching, picked up several small objects. "Pigeon corn," she announced, holding up the brightly colored grains. "Dyed barley, specifically. The sort sold for feeding. Cage birds. Hardly the natural diet of a churchyard raven." Lady Bantry stared at the evidence in Miss Marple's palm. "You mean this was all arranged? The raven? The envelope? The timing of our arrival?" "It does rather suggest a degree of orchestration," Miss Marple admitted, "though why someone should go to such elaborate lengths to deliver a simple list of names is a question that interests me considerably." It was at this point that Inspector Slack arrived, summoned by some village communication network that always seemed to operate with remarkable efficiency when unusual events occurred in St. Mary Mead. He was a solid, practical man with a sort of expression that suggested he had seen quite enough of unusual events and would prefer to deal with straightforward matters like stolen bicycles and boundary disputes. "Now then," he said, eyeing the assembled group with the weary resignation of a man who had learned to expect complications whenever Miss Marple was involved in the discovery of anything more unusual than a missing cat. "What's all this about? Ravens and mysterious letters?" Reverend Clement handed him the envelope and its contents, explaining the circumstances of its discovery. Inspector Slack examined both the paper and the envelope with professional thoroughness, noting the quality of the stationery and the precision of the typing. "Remington typewriter," he observed. "Common enough. This raised R and the weakness in the O might help identify the specific machine if it comes to that." He looked up at the assembled faces. "Though I'm not entirely convinced we're dealing with anything more serious than someone's rather elaborate practical joke." "A practical joke that includes the names of 5 respectable village residents?" asked Miss Marple mildly. "I wonder what sort of mind would consider such a thing amusing." Inspector Slack pocketed the envelope and its contents. "I'll make some inquiries," he said, "starting with the people named on this list. See if any of them have reason to expect, well, whatever this is supposed to represent." As the group began to disperse, Miss Marple lingered by the lich gate, her eyes moving thoughtfully from the sweat-smeared post to the scattered pigeon corn, from the tiny hole in the envelope flap to the precise positioning of the bench where the envelope had been found. "Something troubles you, Jane." Lady Bantry had returned to collect her friend. "Several things, actually," Miss Marple replied. "The theatrical nature of the delivery suggests someone who enjoys dramatic effects. The careful timing implies advanced planning. The choice of names—" She paused, considering. "They represent a cross-section of village life, don't they? The retired teacher, the bedridden gentleman, the postmistress, the church verger, the domestic servant. Almost as if someone were creating a deliberate pattern." "A pattern of what?" Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and took Lady Bantry's arm. "That, my dear Dolly, remains to be seen. But I have the uncomfortable feeling that this morning's performance was merely the opening act." As they walked away from the lich gate, Neither lady noticed the small figure watching from the shadows of the church porch, nor the way the light caught briefly on something metallic in the watcher's hand, before the figure melted away into the deeper shadows beyond the vestry door. Chapter 2. 5 Names in Black Ink. Inspector Slack had established himself in the vicar's study with a sort of methodical efficiency that characterized his approach to all police matters. The room, with its well-worn leather chairs and shelves lined with theological treatises, provided an appropriately serious atmosphere for the taking of official statements. "Now then, Reverend," he began, his notebook poised with bureaucratic precision. "You're quite certain the church was properly secured last night?" Leonard Clement adjusted his spectacles thoughtfully. "Absolutely certain, Inspector. I always check the doors myself after evening. The main door, the vestry entrance, and the door to the bell tower, all locked as they have been every night for the past 15 years. And the lich gate itself, that's not locked, I assume? No, naturally not. It's a public right-of-way. But I can't imagine why anyone would choose to leave mysterious envelopes there of all places." Inspector Slack made a note and turned to Ephraim Potley, who sat perched nervously on the edge of his chair like a sparrow ready to take flight at the first sign of danger. "You passed the lich gate this morning. At what time, Potley?" "6, sir. Just as I always do. I come early to ring the bell for morning service and to see that everything's in order. There was nothing on that bench then. I'd stake my position on it." "And you heard the bird?" Potley shifted uncomfortably. "Well, sir, there was a sort of croaking sound from that direction. But birds make all manner of noises at dawn, don't they? I didn't think particularly of it until I saw that great black creature sitting there, bold as brass, when I came back later." Miss Marple, who had been granted permission to observe the proceedings due to her role as discoverer of the envelope, interjected gently. "Mr. Potla, you mentioned you came back later. At what time would that have been?" "Just gone 9 miss. I'd finished with the bell and was heading home for my breakfast when I noticed the ladies at the gate." Inspector Slack looked up from his notebook. "So between 6 and 9, someone placed that envelope and arranged for the Raven to be present. Rather a narrow window of opportunity." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "we might learn something from examining the envelope itself more carefully. You mentioned the typewriter, the raised R and the weak O, seemed quite distinctive." Slack produced the envelope from his jacket pocket and spread it on the Reverend's desk. The typing was indeed neat and professional, but even to inexpert eyes the peculiarities Miss Marple had noted were clearly visible. "Remington," Slack confirmed. "Probably an older model given the character variations. The question is, how many such typewriters are there in St. Mary Mead?" "The post office has one," offered Reverend Clement. "Mrs. Priest uses it for official correspondence, and I believe Mr. Holt at the ironmongery keeps one for his business letters and the occasional parish notice." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest. "Mr. Holt's establishment, the ironmongery and seed shop on the High Street. That's right. Digby Holt taken over the business from old Mr. Crowther about 3 years ago. Pleasant fellow with quite an interesting background, actually. He was in music hall before the war, if you can believe it. Some sort of conjuring act, I'm told." "A conjurer," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "How very interesting." Inspector Slack was already making notes. "I want to examine both typewriters, of course. See if either one matches these characteristics." He studied the envelope again. "There's something else that strikes me as odd. This paper quality is rather fine for ordinary correspondence, and the black edging suggests morning stationery as though," said Miss Marple quietly, "someone wished to suggest that death was already anticipated. The uncomfortable silence that greeted this observation was broken by a knock at the study door. Mrs. Clement entered with a tea tray, her face wearing the expression of determined cheerfulness that indicated she had been listening at the keyhole and felt compelled to contribute to the proceedings. "I thought you gentlemen need refreshment," she announced, setting the tray down with rather more force than necessary. "And I wanted to mention that I saw young Billy Crowther feeding birds near the Lich Gate yesterday afternoon. A great handful of what looked like colored corn or some such thing." "Billy Crowther?" inquired Inspector Slack. "One of the village boys, about 12 years old, I should think. Lives with his grandmother since his parents passed. She's old Mrs. Crowther, who used to run the seed shop before Mr. Holt took it over." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea gratefully. "Mrs. Clement, did you notice what sort of birds Billy was feeding?" "Oh, the usual sorts. Sparrows, starlings, that kind of thing. Though, now that I think of it, there was rather a large blackbird among them. Quite tame, it seemed. Not at all afraid of the boy." "A raven, perhaps." Mrs. Clement considered this. "It could have been, I suppose. I'm not much of a one for distinguishing between corvids, as my husband would say. But it was certainly large enough." Inspector Slack finished his tea and stood. "I think a visit to Mr. Holt's establishment might be in order, and perhaps a word with this Billy Crowther as well." The group made their way from the vicarage to the high street, where Holt's ironmongery and Seed occupied a corner position that had clearly seen better days. The shop window displayed the usual assortment of garden tools, household implements, and agricultural supplies. But Miss Marple's attention was immediately caught by a placard advertising birdseed from Benham Gazette suppliers. "Look there," she murmured to Lady Bantry, who had joined them for what she termed moral support. "That notice in the window. See how the R in birdseed sits slightly higher than the other letters." Lady Bantry squinted at the sign. "By George, you're right. It's exactly the same as that peculiarity in the envelope." Digby Holt proved to be a man of perhaps 50 years, with the sort of expansive manner and quick smile that spoke of his theatrical background. He was of medium height, but moved with an economy of gesture that suggested someone accustomed to making dramatic effects with minimal fuss. His hands, Miss Marple noted, were those of a craftsman, strong, precise, and somehow always in motion. "Inspector Slack," he greeted them warmly, "and Miss Marple, Lady Bantry. An honor to have such distinguished visitors to my humble establishment, though I suspect this isn't entirely a social call." "Indeed not, Mr. Holt. I wonder if I might examine your typewriter. We're investigating a matter involving some typed correspondence." Of course. It's just here behind the counter. I use it for invoices, the occasional letter, and sometimes the Reverend asks me to type up parish notices." He gestured toward an elderly Remington that occupied a place of honor beside his cash register. "Not the newest model, I'm afraid, but it serves well enough." Inspector Slack examined the machine with professional interest, testing several keys and noting the characteristic weaknesses that matched the envelope. "This appears to be the source of our mysterious correspondence," he announced. "The question is, who might have had access to it?" Holt laughed, a sound that contained genuine amusement, but perhaps something else as well. "I'm afraid that's rather a long list, Inspector. I rarely lock the shop during the day, and any number of people pop in and out. Mrs. Priest from the post office occasionally uses it when hers is being repaired. Young Billy Crowther sometimes comes in to type letters for his grandmother, who has terrible arthritis in her hands. Even some of the other village folk have borrowed it from time to time." "Billy Crowther," said Miss Marple. "We were just hearing about Billy and his interest in feeding birds." "Ah, yes. The boy has quite a way with creatures. There's a raven he's particularly fond of. Calls it King Jack, if you can believe it. Trained the thing to come when he whistles. Quite remarkable, really. Trained? Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose. Oh, yes. Billy has the touch for it. Probably learned something from watching me, actually. Old habits from my music hall days, you know. I still keep a few tricks up my sleeve, as it were. He reached into his waist pocket and produced a small silver whistle on a watch chain. This brings the starlings down from the eaves every morning at 10 marks sharp. Regular as clockwork they are. Miss Marple filed away this information with interest. 10 girau, you say? How wonderfully precise. Routine, not magic, I assure you. Holt replied with a wink. Though I must say, the effect can be quite dramatic when you know the timing. As they prepared to leave the shop, Lady Bantry made what she clearly considered to be a jest. Well, Jane, if my Tilda is truly marked for doom, as that wretched list suggests, I shall simply have to lock her in the linen room until this business is sorted. But Miss Marple did not smile at her friend's attempt at humor. Instead, she stood in the doorway of Holt's shop, her eyes moving thoughtfully from the typewriter to the birdseed advertisements, to the small silver whistle that Digby Holt was returning to his pocket with the practiced ease of a professional performer. Yes, she said quietly. I rather think that keeping everyone safely accounted for might be a very wise precaution indeed. Chapter 3. Gas in the schoolmistress's kitchen. The news reached the vicarage just as the church clock was striking 6. Mrs. Clement answered the telephone with the breathless urgency that seemed to accompany all communications in St. Mary, Mead during times of crisis, and her face grew steadily paler as she listened to the voice on the other end. Leonard, she called to her husband, who was in his study preparing tomorrow's sermon. You must come at once. It's Miss Trent. Mrs. Ashworth found her. Oh dear, I hardly know how to say it. Miss Marple, who'd been invited to take supper with the Clements, set down her teacup with careful precision. She had learned over many years of village life to recognize the particular quality of distress that accompanies genuinely serious news. What has happened to Miss Trent? She asked quietly. Mrs. Clement's hand trembled as she replaced the telephone receiver. She's dead, Jane. Found in her kitchen by Mrs. Ashworth when she came to collect the library books for tomorrow's exchange. The gas, it appears she was overcome by gas from her stove. Within 20 minutes, a small procession had formed outside Rose Cottage, Miss Phyllis Trent's modest dwelling on Church Lane. Dr. Haydick had arrived first, his medical bag in hand, and his face bearing the grave expression that marked his transition from village physician to official pronouncer of death. Inspector Slack followed shortly after, his notebook already open, and his manner suggesting that coincidences involving mysterious lists and sudden deaths were not things he was prepared to accept without considerable investigation. Miss Marple approached the cottage with the careful attention she might have given to navigating unfamiliar terrain. Rose Cottage was typical of its kind. A neat Georgian structure with a well-tended garden and the sort of orderly appearance that suggested its occupant had been a woman of methodical habits and modest means. Mrs. Ashworth, a stout widow who served as the unofficial coordinator of the village's literary circulation, stood wringing her hands beside the front gate. I knocked and knocked, she was saying to anyone who would listen. The door wasn't locked, so I went in to collect the books as usual. The smell hit me the moment I stepped inside. Dreadful it was. Poor Miss Trent was just lying there by the stove. Dr. Haydock emerged from the cottage, stripping off his gloves with the brisk efficiency of a man who had seen too many such scenes. Asphyxiation, he announced to Inspector Slack. Carbon monoxide poisoning, most likely. The oven door was open, and there's clear evidence of gas accumulation in the kitchen. Accident? Slack left the question unfinished. Could be either, Dr. Haydock replied. The elderly sometimes become confused about gas appliances, particularly when they're feeling unwell or distressed. On the other hand, he glanced meaningfully at the cottage. Given this morning's peculiar business with that list, I'd suggest you examine the scene very carefully indeed. Miss Marple had been listening to this exchange while studying the cottage's exterior with the sort of systematic attention she usually reserved for complex knitting patterns. Now she addressed Inspector Slack with a diffident manner that often preceded her most penetrating observations. Inspector, would it be possible for me to look at Miss Trent's kitchen? I knew her quite well, you see, and I might notice if anything appears out of the ordinary. Slack hesitated, but the memory of previous cases in which Miss Marple's observations had proved valuable overcame his official reluctance. Very well, but please don't touch anything. The kitchen of Rose Cottage was a model of domestic efficiency, even in death. The surfaces were spotless, the implements arranged with military precision, and everything spoke of a woman who had lived by strict routine for many decades. Miss Trent's body had been removed, but the scene remained largely undisturbed. Miss Marple moved through the small space with a careful deliberation of someone reading a very important letter. She paused first at the gas stove where the oven door hung open like a gaping mouth. The kettle, she murmured, noting the copper vessel that sat on the hob. It's completely full. How curious. Inspector Slack looked up from his examination of the gas taps. Curious? Miss Trent lived alone and was most economical in all her habits. She always boiled precisely 1 cup of water for her evening tea, never more. Yet this kettle contains enough water for 6 cups. She moved to the small table where a tea towel hung neatly from a wooden rail. And this towel is hung lengthwise. Miss Trent always folded her towels corner to corner. It was something of a signature habit. She was quite particular about it. You're suggesting someone else was here? I'm suggesting that Miss Trent's final actions were not entirely consistent with her established patterns. Miss Marple opened the door to the sitting room and peered inside. Her budgerigar appears quite lively. If the entire cottage had filled with gas, as one might expect, the bird would surely have succumbed as well. She returned to the kitchen and knelt beside the gas tap, her sharp eyes examining the brass fitting with microscopic attention. Inspector, would you look at this? There's a very faint groove in the metal just here, as though a piece of string or thin rope had been looped around the tap and then removed with some force. Slack bent to examine the mark she indicated. It was barely visible, but undeniably present. A thin line scored into the brass where something had been pulled tight, and then jerked away. And in the scullery, Miss Marple continued, moving to the small adjoining room where Miss Trent kept her cleaning supplies and refuse bin. We have this. She indicated a crumpled matchbox that lay among the kitchen scraps. The cardboard was stained with what appeared to be soot or stove black, and several spent matches were scattered nearby. Yet Miss Trent has used electric ignition for her stove since the end of the blackout restrictions, Miss Marple observed. She mentioned it specifically at the last parish meeting, saying how much safer and more convenient it was than matches. Inspector, Slack picked up the matchbox with his handkerchief, studying the stains. So why would she suddenly revert to using matches? Perhaps, said Miss Marple thoughtfully, because someone wanted it to appear that she had been using matches. Someone who needed to suggest a reason why she might have been close to the gas tap at the moment when the accident occurred. They were interrupted by the arrival of Lady Bantry, who had come as soon as word reached Gossington Hall. She stood in the kitchen doorway, taking in the scene with the sort of horrified fascination that marked her transition from gossip enthusiast to witness of genuine tragedy. "Poor Phyllis," she murmured. "To think that just this morning her name was on that dreadful list, and now it's almost as though someone knew." Miss Marple turned to face her friend, and there was something in her expression that made Lady Bantry step back involuntarily. "Yes, Dolly," she said quietly. "Someone did know. The question is whether they knew because they could predict the future, or because they were actively involved in creating it." As the small group prepared to leave Rose Cottage to the ministrations of the official investigation, Miss Marple paused at the garden gate. The evening was drawing in, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell was tolling. Whether for evensong or for the passing of Phyllis Trent, it was impossible to say. She had no despair to frequent, Miss Marple said suddenly, her voice so quiet that Inspector Slack had to strain to hear her. "I beg your pardon?" "Something Miss Trent said to me once about people who take their own lives. She said they must have despair to frequent, a place in their hearts where hopelessness lived." Miss Trent had no such place. She was planning to count the library fines with Mrs. Priest tomorrow morning, and she had promised to help with the church jumble sale next week. These are not the actions of a woman contemplating self-destruction. She turned to look back at Rose Cottage, now dark and silent in the gathering dusk. "No, Inspector. Miss Phyllis Trent was murdered, and whoever did it wanted us to believe it was either accident or suicide. The question now is whether they will be content with one name from their list or whether this is merely the beginning." Chapter 4. Corn, Sweet, and a Black Feather. The morning following Miss Trent's death brought a low-hanging mist that seemed to settle over St. Mary Mead like a shroud. Miss Marple had risen earlier than usual, driven by the restless energy that often accompanied her involvement in matters of serious import. She had taken her customary walk through the village, ostensibly to purchase stamps at the post office, but in reality to observe the subtle changes that tragedy brings to a small community. The children were the first to notice the raven's return. "Look, Miss! Look there!" called young Tommy Pierce, pointing excitedly toward the lich gate as Miss Marple approached the church. "He's back again, the big black bird." Indeed, perched upon the same crossbeam where it had appeared the previous morning, sat the magnificent raven. It seemed even more at ease than before, if such a thing were possible, preening its glossy feathers with the sort of casual confidence that suggested ownership of the territory. Miss Marple quickened her pace, arriving at the lich gate just as the bird completed its morning toilette. The raven regarded her with bright, intelligent eyes, tilted its head in what might have been acknowledgement, and then opened its beak to emit that same harsh, carrying croak that had announced its presence 24 hours earlier. "Shoo, you nasty creature," called Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, who had emerged from her shop to see what was causing the commotion. "Haven't you caused enough trouble already?" But the raven seemed supremely indifferent to Mrs. Price's displeasure. With the same theatrical timing it had displayed the day before, it spread its wings, gave another resonant call, and launched itself into the morning air. This time, however, Miss Marple was ready for its departure. She had positioned herself so that she could observe not only the bird's exit, but also the exact spot where it had been perched. As the raven disappeared over the church tower, she moved quickly to examine the crossbeam. What she found there confirmed her growing suspicions about the theatrical nature of these appearances. The beam showed fresh smears of sweat applied so recently that they were still slightly sticky to the touch. But more interesting than the sweat itself was its placement. Deliberate dollops positioned precisely where the bird's feet would naturally grip the wood. Encouragement, she murmured to herself, provided at exactly the right location. She was examining these traces when Lady Bantry arrived, slightly out of breath and wearing the expression of someone who had received disturbing news over the breakfast table. "Jane, thank heavens you're here. I've just heard the most dreadful gossip from Mrs. Ashworth. She's saying that Miss Trent didn't die by accident at all, and that someone in the village is systematically working through that horrible list." "News travels quickly," Miss Marple observed, continuing her examination of the lich-gate. "Though I suspect Mrs. Ashworth's interpretation may be somewhat more dramatic than the facts warrant. But surely you don't think there's nothing to worry about? Yesterday morning Miss Trent's name was on that list, and by evening she was dead. That cannot be mere coincidence." Miss Marple had moved her attention to the gravel beneath the beam. "No, Dolly, I don't believe it was coincidence. But I'm beginning to think the connection may be rather different from what Mrs. Ashworth imagines. She knelt and picked up a single object from among the scattered stones. A black feather, long and glossy, clearly from the raven's plumage. But as she held it up to catch the morning light, something about its appearance struck her as distinctly odd. "How curious," she said, turning the feather this way and that. "This has an almost oily sheen to it. Not the natural gloss of healthy plumage, but something applied afterward." "Applied? You mean someone has been polishing raven feathers?" "Linseed oil, I believe. The sort used for preserving leather and for giving artificial sheen to show animals or show birds when they're being photographed or displayed." They were interrupted by the arrival of Digby Holt, who approached from the direction of his shop with the brisk stride of a man attending to morning business. He carried a small canvas bag that clearly contained grain or seed, and his manner was cheerfully matter-of-fact. "Good morning, ladies. I see our feathered friend has been holding court again. Quite the performer, isn't he?" "Mr. Holt," said Miss Marple, "you seem remarkably well informed about this bird's habits." Holt laughed, setting down his bag and reaching into his waistcoat pocket for the small silver whistle he had displayed the previous day. "Trade secrets, Miss Marple. Once you understand that birds are creatures of routine, they become quite predictable." He placed the whistle to his lips and produced a soft liquid call that seemed to float on the morning air. Within moments there was a rustling from the direction of the church tower, and the raven reappeared, circling once before settling on the crossbeam with the precision of a well-rehearsed actor hitting his mark. "Remarkable," breathed Lady Bantry. "It's almost as though the creature is trained." "Oh, he is," Holt replied casually, opening his canvas bag to reveal a mixture of suet lumps and brightly colored grain. "Takes patience, of course, but ravens are intelligent birds. This fellow responds to the whistle, comes for his breakfast, and puts on quite a show for the village children. Punctual as clockwork, arrives within 2 minutes of my call every time." Miss Marple watched with fascination as Holt scattered the food along the crossbeam. The raven descended immediately, pecking at the offerings with obvious familiarity. "How long have you been feeding him, Mr. Holt?" "Oh, several months now. Started quite by accident when I was testing some new birdseed mixtures. He seemed interested, so I began putting out regular meals. The children love to watch him. Gives them something to look forward to each morning. And the timing. You mentioned 10 months yesterday as your usual feeding time." "That's right, creatures of habit, as I said. Though I must confess I've been varying the schedule a bit lately. Sometimes earlier, sometimes later. Keeps him alert, you might say." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Lady Bantry. "Mr. Holt, yesterday morning you mentioned that starlings come to your eaves at 10 and swart, but you summoned this raven just now with a different call at a different time." For the first time, Holt's cheerful demeanor showed a slight crack. "Well, yes, different birds, different signals. The starlings are wild, you see. They've simply learned to associate my 10-more whistle with food scraps. But King Jack here? He gestured toward the raven. He's more of a personal project. King Jack, the children's name for him. Rather appropriate, don't you think? He certainly rules this corner of the churchyard. As if responding to his name, the raven finished his meal, fixed Holt with what appeared to be an approving stare, and then hopped to the edge of the beam. With a final croak that might have been gratitude or dismissal, he spread his wings and vanished once more in the direction of the church tower. Miss Marple picked up the black feather she'd found earlier, studying it once more in the clearer light that followed the mist lifting. "Mr. Holt," she said quietly, "you mentioned your background in music hall. I imagine that involved considerable work with trained animals." "Some," he admitted. "Doves mainly, the occasional rabbit or two. Nothing as sophisticated as a raven, though I must say King Jack has exceeded my expectations." And the preparation involved in such performances, the grooming, the enhancement of natural appearance for stage purposes. Holt's eyes sharpened, slightly, though his smile remained in place. One does what one must to ensure the best possible presentation. Audiences expect a certain theatrical quality. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, slipping the oiled feather into her handbag. "Indeed they do, Mr. Holt. Indeed they do." As they watched the conjurer-turned-shopkeeper return to his establishment, Lady Bantry voiced the question that hung in the morning air like the dissipating mist. "Jane, you don't really think that Mr. Holt is somehow involved in this business, do you? He seems such a pleasant, harmless sort of man." Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and took her friend's arm. "My dear Dolly, I have learned over the years that the most dangerous people are often those who seem the most harmless. And when a man with theatrical training and a tame raven appears in a village just months before mysterious envelopes begin appearing beneath that same raven's perch, well, one begins to wonder about the nature of coincidence." She paused at the Lich Gate, looking back toward Holt's shop, where the morning sun was beginning to illuminate the window displays. "Someone wanted us to find that envelope yesterday morning at precisely the right moment. Someone who could ensure that a raven would be present to provide dramatic emphasis, and someone who knew exactly when Lady Bantry and I would be returning from the vicarage. But how could anyone know our precise timing? Because, my dear, we are creatures of habit, just like the birds, and someone has been studying our habits very carefully indeed." Chapter 5. The second envelope at the wrong hour. The discovery of the second envelope came at 11, when the morning's activities should have settled into their normal rhythm. Ephraim Potley had been making his customary rounds of the churchyard, checking for any damage from the previous night's wind, and ensuring that the flower arrangements on the graves remained properly tended. It was his cry of alarm that drew Miss Marple and Inspector Slack from their quiet conference in the vicarage garden, where they had been discussing the peculiarities of Miss Trent's death over Mrs. Clement's excellent seed cake. "Inspector! Miss Marple!" Pottle called, his voice carrying a note of panic that seemed to echo off the stone walls of St. Mary's. "There's another one, another envelope, just like yesterday." They found the verger standing beside the Lich Gate bench, his face pale with the sort of shock that comes from having one's worst fears confirmed. The envelope lay precisely where its predecessor had been placed, centered on the worn wood with almost mathematical precision. Inspector Slack approached the bench with a careful deliberation of a man who had learned not to take anything at face value. "When did you find this, Potley?" "Just now, sir. I was tidying the memorial wreaths on the Ashford plot when I noticed it. Wasn't there 10 minutes ago when I passed this way? I'd stake my life on it." Miss Marple studied the envelope without touching it, her keen eyes taking in every detail. Like its predecessor, it bore the distinctive black edging and was made of the same quality cream paper. The same raised R and weak O were visible in the typing, confirming its origin from the Remington at Holt's establishment. "May I?" she inquired of Inspector Slack, who nodded his permission. The envelope opened to reveal another typed list, but this one contained only 4 names: Mr. Osric Fielding, Mrs. Ivy Priest Ephraim, Pottle Tilda Briggs. "Miss Trent's name has been omitted," observed Miss Marple quietly. "How very methodical." Potley, seeing his own name still included on the revised list, made a small whimpering sound and sank onto the bench, beside the envelope. "This is some sort of curse, isn't it? Someone's marking us for death, one by one." "Nonsense," said Inspector Slack, though his tone lacked complete conviction. "Someone's playing elaborate practical jokes, though I'll admit the timing is rather unfortunate." Miss Marple, however, had turned her attention to the church clock, whose hands clearly indicated 11. "Inspector, didn't Mr. Holt mention yesterday that his raven appears at 10 kites when summoned by his whistle?" "That's right. The bird was punctual as clockwork." "Then why," Miss Marple asked thoughtfully, "would this envelope appear at 11? If someone wished to maintain the theatrical illusion of the raven delivering mysterious messages, surely they would adhere to the established schedule." She moved closer to the Lichgate structure itself, examining the wooden crossbeam with the same careful attention she'd given it that morning. What she found there provided another piece of the increasingly complex puzzle. "Look here," she said, pointing to a small hardened drop of wax clinging to the underside of the beam. "Candle wax, I believe, still quite fresh. It couldn't have been here long in this dampness." Inspector Slack scraped off a sample with his penknife. "Ordinary tallow by the look of it, the sort used in household candles." "And here," Miss Marple continued, indicating a small hole in the wood where a fresh tack had recently been driven, "someone has used this beam as a temporary mounting point. The wood splinters are still bright and unstained." "You mean someone pinned the envelope up there earlier and intended it to be found later?" "Precisely. But something went wrong with the timing. This envelope was meant to be discovered at 10 bar an hour during the raven's regular feeding time. Instead, it remained hidden until now. They were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Priest from the Aishi post office, who had clearly heard the news through the village's remarkably efficient communication network. She was a thin, anxious woman with the sort of perpetually worried expression that comes from dealing with other people's correspondence and the secrets it might contain. "Is it true? Another list with our names on it? Oh, what are we to do? First poor Miss Trent, and now—" "Mrs. Priest," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "you work closely with the post, naturally. Have you noticed anything unusual in recent days? Any letters that seemed out of the ordinary, or perhaps changes in regular patterns of correspondence?" Mrs. Priest wrung her hands, clearly struggling with some internal conflict. "Well, there was something rather odd yesterday. That new nurse up at Fielding House, Miss Ferris, she brought back a letter I'd prepared for posting. Said I'd forgotten to put a stamp on it, though I could have sworn I had." "What sort of letter was it?" "Official business. I was writing to the matron at St. Luke's Hospital in London. Miss Trent had asked me to make some inquiries about Miss Ferris herself, actually. Something about her previous employment." Inspector Slack's attention sharpened considerably. "Miss Trent asked you to investigate Nurse Ferris?" "Not investigate exactly, but she seemed to think she recognized the woman from somewhere, and it was troubling her. She said she wanted to be certain before she spoke to Mr. Fielding about it. You know how particular Miss Trent was about accuracy in all matters." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful look with Inspector Slack. "Mrs. Priest," When Miss Ferris returned this letter to you, did you have occasion to examine the envelope? Oh, yes. I had to reseal it after adding the stamp. Funny. Thing, though, the flap seemed to have been opened and closed already. I had to use fish glue from my desk drawer because the original gum had lost its adhesion. Fish glue, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Not the usual gum arabic supplied by the post office? No, my own supply. I keep it for repairs and special. Sealing jobs. Has quite a distinctive smell, rather fishy as you might expect. Miss Marple's eyes brightened with the sort of satisfaction that comes from having a theory confirmed by unexpected evidence. Mrs. Priest, do you happen to recall where you purchased that particular glue? Why? At Holt's Ironmongery, naturally. He stocks all manner of household supplies. Mentioned it was popular with model makers and people doing fine craft work. Inspector Slack made careful notes of this information, though his expression suggested he was not entirely certain where these various threads might lead. Mrs. Priest, this letter to St. Luke's Hospital, has it been posted? Oh, yes. Yesterday afternoon. Miss Ferris was most insistent that it go out promptly, despite the confusion about the stamp. As Mrs. Priest departed to tend to her postal duties, Miss Marple stood quietly beside the lich gate, her mind working through the implications of what they had learned. The pattern was becoming clearer, though the full picture remained frustratingly elusive. "Inspector," she said finally, "I believe we are dealing with something far more sophisticated than random village mischief. Someone has been very careful to establish connections between these various elements. The raven, the envelopes, the timing, and now Miss Trent's inquiries about Nurse Ferris. You think there's a connection between Miss Trent's death and her interest in the nurse?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that Miss Trent may have stumbled upon something that made her dangerous to someone with very specific plans. And I think that someone has been using our theatrical friend, Mr. Holt's apparatus, to create confusion and misdirection while those plans are carried out." She looked up at the crossbeam, where the evidence of careful preparation remained visible in the form of tack holes and candle wax. "The question now, Inspector, is whether we can unravel this performance before the next name on that list meets the same fate as poor Miss Trent." Chapter 6. A Letter That Was Sealed Twice. The post office of St. Mary Mead occupied a corner position in what had once been a private dwelling, its conversion to official business evident in the addition of a substantial counter and the installation of sorting compartments that lined one entire wall. Miss Marple entered the establishment that afternoon with the sort of purposeful air that suggested she'd come for something rather more specific than postage stamps. Mrs. Priest looked up from her ledger with the harried expression of someone who had spent the day fielding inquiries about mysterious envelopes and untimely deaths. "Miss Marple, I do hope you haven't come about that dreadful business at the Lich Gate. I've told Inspector Slack everything I know, and I'm sure I can't add anything more. Actually, Mrs. Priest, I was hoping you might show me the letter you mentioned earlier, the one to St. Luke's Hospital that required resealing." Mrs. Priest's face took on the troubled look of someone being asked to reveal confidences that were not strictly her own. "Well, I suppose there's no harm in it now. The letter has been posted after all, and Miss Trent, oh dear, Miss Trent won't be needing discretion anymore, will she?" She moved to a shelf behind the counter where several completed letters awaited the evening collection. "I kept a copy of the envelope, you understand, for my records, in case there were any questions about the postage or delivery." The envelope she produced bore Mrs. Priest's careful handwriting addressing the matron of St. Luke's Hospital in Chew, London, but it was the condition of the flap that immediately captured Miss Marple's attention. "How very interesting," she murmured, holding the envelope up to catch the afternoon light streaming through the post office window. There appears to be two distinct lines of adhesive here. Indeed, examination revealed that the envelope had been sealed with two different substances. The original factory gum arabic formed one line along the flap's edge, but beneath it ran a second, darker line that carried a distinctly different odor. That's the fish glue, Mrs. Priest confirmed. I had to use it after Miss Ferris brought the letter back. The original seal had come undone somehow. Miss Marple studied the envelope with the sort of concentration she usually reserved for particularly complex knitting patterns. Mrs. Priest, when Miss Ferris returned this letter, did she offer any explanation for how the seal had failed? She said it must have been the dampness. Mentioned that she'd kept it in her bag overnight and that the morning mist might have affected the gum. Seemed reasonable enough at the time. And the stamp? You mentioned it was missing. Mrs. Priest nodded emphatically. That was the strangest thing. I was certain I'd affixed the proper postage, but when Miss Ferris brought it back, there was no stamp to be seen. She was quite helpful. About it, actually. Said she'd save me the trouble of walking to the collection box if I'd let her take it directly. Miss Marple set the envelope carefully on the counter, her mind working through the implications of what she was seeing. The fishy odor from the second adhesive was unmistakable, and it matched exactly the scent she had detected on the mysterious Lichgate envelope. Mrs. Priest, you mentioned purchasing this fish glue from Mr. Holt's establishment. Do you recall when you made that purchase? Oh, it must have been a fortnight ago, perhaps longer. I needed it for some repair work on my personal correspondence files. Mr. Holt recommended it particularly, said it was stronger than ordinary paste and wouldn't be affected by moisture. And did he mention any other customers who might have purchased the same product? Mrs. Priest considered this carefully. Now that you mention it, he did say it was becoming quite popular. Mentioned that several people had been asking for it recently, for model making, he said, and other delicate work that required a secure bond. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Priest for her assistance and made her way thoughtfully toward Fielding House, the substantial Victorian residence on Old Quarry Lane, where Mr. Osric Fielding maintained his invalid existence under the care of Nurse Ruth Ferris. The house itself bore the sort of faded gentility that spoke of better days and diminished circumstances. The garden, while neat, showed signs of economical maintenance, and the paintwork, though clean, clearly dated from some years past. It was the sort of establishment that suggested its owner possessed sufficient means for comfort, but not enough for luxury. Nurse Ferris answered Miss Marple's knock with the sort of brisk efficiency that characterized professional caregivers. She was a woman of perhaps 35 years with auburn hair arranged in a practical style and the kind of competent manner that inspired confidence in worried relatives. Miss Marple, isn't it? I'm afraid Mr. Fielding isn't receiving visitors today. He's had rather a difficult morning. I quite understand, Miss Marple replied pleasantly. Actually, I was hoping to have a brief word with you, if I might, about the unfortunate business with Miss Trent, and the inquiry she was making. Something flickered in Nurse Ferris's eyes. Perhaps annoyance, perhaps concern. Miss Trent? I'm afraid I don't understand what inquiries you mean. The letter to St. Luke's Hospital. Mrs. Priest mentioned that you'd been kind enough to help with the posting when there was some confusion about the stamp. Oh, that. Nurse Ferris stepped out onto the front porch, closing the door behind her. Yes, poor Mrs. Priest had forgotten the postage. I offered to take care of it for her since I was passing the post office anyway. And the letter's contents? I assume Miss Trent explained why she was writing to the hospital? For the first time, Nurse Ferris's professional composure showed a crack. I'm sure I don't pry into other people's correspondence, Miss Marple. If Miss Trent was conducting some sort of inquiry, that was entirely her own affair. But Miss Marple had caught the slight emphasis on the word was, and she filed it away with the other small inconsistencies that were beginning to form a pattern. Of course, she said mildly. though I can't help wondering if Miss Trent's concerns might have been related to the mysterious list that appeared at the lich gate. After all, your patient, Mr. Fielding, is named on it as well. Mr. Fielding is a nervous gentleman, Nurse Ferris replied stiffly. I make it my policy to shield him from village gossip and unpleasant speculation. He has quite enough to worry about with his various ailments without adding superstitious nonsense to his burdens. Indeed. And you've been caring for him. How long now? Nearly 6 months, since his previous nurse left rather suddenly. Miss Marple filed this information away as well. Well, I do hope he continues to improve under your excellent care. It must be reassuring for him to have someone so dedicated to his welfare. As she walked away from Fielding House, Miss Marple reflected on the curious fact that Nurse Ferris had been far more forthcoming about her patient's condition than about her own interaction with Miss Trent's letter. In her experience, people who were scrupulously professional about one matter while being evasive about another usually had very specific reasons for the distinction. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the trees as she made her way back toward the village center, but her steps carried her not toward home, but toward the ironmongery establishment, where Digby Holt conducted his varied business activities. She found him in the process of cleaning his shop windows, whistling a music hall tune as he worked. The sound carried clearly in the still air, the same liquid, carrying notes she'd heard him use to summon his trained raven. "Mr. Holt?" she called pleasantly. "I wonder if you might spare a moment for a question about adhesives." He turned from his window, cleaning with the ready smile that seemed to be his natural expression. "Adhesives?" "Why, certainly, Miss Marple, though I must say that's not the sort of inquiry I usually receive from ladies of the village. I'm interested in that fish glue you recommended to Mrs. Priest. You mentioned it was becoming quite popular for delicate work." "Indeed it is, stronger than ordinary paste, and it doesn't lose its grip in damp conditions. Quite useful for anyone doing precise work that needs to stay precisely in place." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "The sort of work that might involve, say, temporarily affixing something to a wooden surface with a tack, then ensuring it remained secure until the proper moment for discovery." Digby Holt's cheerful expression never wavered, but Miss Marple thought she detected a slight pause in his window cleaning. "I suppose it could be used for such purposes," he said carefully. "Though I must say, Miss Marple, you have a rather inventive imagination when it comes to the applications of simple household products." "Perhaps," she replied, "though I've always found that the most innocent household products can sometimes serve the most unexpected purposes in the right hands." As she left the ironmongery, Miss Marple carried with her the certainty that the various threads of this curious case were beginning to weave themselves into a recognizable pattern. The fish glue, the twice-sealed letter, the strategic timing of inquiries and envelopes. All of it suggested a careful orchestration by someone who understood both human nature and the mechanics of deception. The question that remained was whether she could unravel the full design before it reached whatever conclusion its architect had planned. Chapter 7. The Raven That Arrived at 10. The following morning brought crystalline clarity to both the autumn air and Miss Marple's understanding of the theatrical performance being enacted in St. Mary Mead. She had risen before dawn to position herself strategically in the churchyard, armed with a small wicker basket containing lumps of sweet procured from the village butcher, and a notebook in which to record her observations. Lady Bantry, who had been prevailed upon to serve as witness to this experiment, sat beside her on the stone bench near the Ashford Memorial, wrapped in a thick woolen coat and wearing the expression of someone who was not entirely convinced of the wisdom of their early morning vigil. "Jane," she whispered, though there was no one else in sight, "are you quite certain this is necessary? Sitting in a churchyard at 9 in the morning watching for ravens seems rather peculiar. Patience, my dear, Miss Marple replied, checking the small silver watch pinned to her cardigan. If my theory is correct, we shall have our demonstration shortly. At precisely 10 gasaiges, Miss Marple produced a penny whistle from her handbag, a simple instrument she had borrowed from young Tommy Pierce, and attempted to reproduce the liquid call she had heard Digby Holt use. Her first effort was rather wavering and uncertain, but her second attempt carried more confidence. The response was immediate and gratifying, with a rushing of wings that seemed to materialize from the very air itself. The magnificent raven appeared above the church tower, circled once with leisurely precision, and settled on the Lich Gate crossbeam with the sort of theatrical timing that would have earned applause in any London music hall. "Good heavens," breathed Lady Bantry. "It's exactly as though someone rang a dinner bell." Miss Marple approached the Lich Gate with her basket of sweet, moving slowly to avoid startling their feathered performer. The raven regarded her with bright intelligence, tilting its head as if assessing her credentials as a substitute provider. "He keeps feeding time," she observed quietly. "Not postal hours." She scattered several lumps of sweet along the crossbeam, then placed a clean envelope, one of her own personal stationery, beside the food. The raven descended immediately to investigate the offerings, pecking enthusiastically at the sweet while completely ignoring the envelope. "Most instructive," Miss Marple murmured, making notes in her little book. "He shows no interest whatever in paper or envelopes. His training is purely elementary." Having satisfied himself with the unexpected breakfast, the raven gave a single harsh croak of what might have been gratitude and launched himself back toward his roost in the church tower. Inspector Slack, who had arrived during the feeding demonstration, watched the bird's departure with professional interest. "So, you're suggesting that someone has been using this creature's punctual habits to provide dramatic emphasis for their envelope deliveries?" "More than that," Miss Marple replied, examining the crossbeam where fresh evidence of preparation was visible. "Look here, another tack hole, precisely positioned where yesterday's second envelope would have hung. And here, a second small hole in the wood itself." She pointed to two tiny perforations, one slightly higher than the other. The first envelope was pinned at one height, then moved to adjust the timing. Someone who initially planned for the 10 sire feeding time then realized they needed to alter their schedule. "But why would they need to change the timing?" "Because," said Miss Marple, "something went wrong with their original plan. Perhaps they were interrupted, or perhaps they realized that tennoids would not provide the dramatic impact they desired." She led Inspector Slack back toward the village center, her steps carrying them inevitably toward Holt's ironmongery. They found the proprietor arranging a display of garden tools in his window, whistling the same music hall melody that had become his signature accompaniment to morning tasks. "Inspector Slack, Miss Marple," he greeted them with characteristic bonhomie. "I trust you're not here about more mysterious envelopes. I do hope this business isn't reflecting poorly on my establishment." "On the contrary, Mr. Holt," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I was hoping you might demonstrate your remarkable skill with bird training once more. That whistle call you showed us yesterday was quite impressive." Holt's eyes brightened with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Ah, you appreciate the finer points of the art. Most people think it's simply a matter of making noise, but there's considerable subtlety involved." He produced his silver whistle and moved to the shop doorway. "The secret, you see, is consistency. Same call, same time, same reward. King Jack has learned to associate this particular sound with his morning meal." The liquid notes floated across the high street, and within moments the raven appeared, following what was clearly a well-established routine. It settled on the shop's signpost, fixed Holt with an expectant stare, and waited for its promised reward. "Punctual fellow," Holt observed with satisfaction, scattering grain along the signpost crossbar. "Always arrives within 2 minutes of the call. You could set your watch by him." Miss Marple watched this performance with the sort of concentrated attention she usually reserved for the most complex of crossword puzzles. "Mr. Holt, when you summon King Jack in this manner, could you direct him to specific locations, say, to the Lich Gate rather than your signpost?" "Oh, certainly. Ravens are remarkably intelligent creatures. With proper training, one could encourage them to visit any number of predetermined locations. Simply a matter of establishing the proper associations between signals and rewards." Inspector Slack had been examining the small bottles and containers that lined Holt's shop counter. "Mr. Holt, I notice you stock fish glue here. Has there been much call for it recently?" "Moderate demand," Holt replied easily. "Mrs. Priest purchased some for postal repairs, and I believe I sold a bottle to Miss Ferris up at Fielding House. Mentioned she needed it for some delicate work with her patient's medical records." "Miss Ferris purchased fish glue?" "Indeed. Quite. Knowledgeable about adhesives, actually. Asked specifically for something that would maintain its bond even in damp conditions. Professional thoroughness, I suppose. One must admire that in a medical attendant." Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged meaningful glances. Another connection had been established in the growing web of relationships that surrounded the mysterious envelope deliveries. As they prepared to leave the ironmongery, Miss Marple paused to examine a collection of small implements that occupied one corner of Holt's counter. Among the usual assortment of tacks, pins, and fasteners, she noticed several items that seemed designed for more specialized purposes. "Model-making supplies?" she inquired. "Among other things," Holt confirmed. "I cater to a variety of hobbies and crafts. You'd be surprised how many people in the village engage in detailed work that requires precise fastening and temporary mounting." "Indeed," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "one never knows what hidden talents exist in a small community." As they walked back toward the vicarage, Inspector Slack voiced the question that had been forming in his mind throughout the morning's investigations. "Miss Marple, you seem to be suggesting that this entire business with the ravens and the envelopes is some sort of elaborate performance. But to what end? What could anyone hope to accomplish with such theatrical nonsense?" Miss Marple paused beside the war memorial, her eyes moving thoughtfully from the church tower where King Jack maintained his roost to Fielding House, where Nurse Ferris attended to her invalid patient. "I believe, Inspector, that someone has been using Mr. Holt's theatrical skills and trained Raven to create a climate of fear and superstition in the village. The question is why they needed such a climate, and what they hoped to accomplish while everyone's attention was focused on mysterious envelopes and prophetic birds." She adjusted her handbag and resumed walking. "But I have a growing suspicion that we shall discover the answer to that question very soon indeed." Chapter 8. The Bitter Cup at Fielding House. The urgent summons came shortly after 2:00 in the afternoon, delivered by young Billy Crowther, who had been pressed into service as a messenger by Nurse Ferris. The boy arrived at the vicarage breathless and wide-eyed, his usual composure shattered by the gravity of his errand. "Dr. Haydock says to come quick," he gasped to Inspector Slack, who had been taking tea with the Clements and Miss Marple. "Mr. Fielding's taken a terrible turn, and they think he might not last the afternoon." The small party that assembled at Fielding House found the Victorian dwelling in a state of controlled crisis. Dr. Haydock's motor car stood in the drive, and through the windows could be glimpsed the sort of bustling activity that accompanies medical emergencies in provincial households. Nurse Ferris met them at the front door. her professional composure intact, but her face bearing the strain of someone who had spent several hours managing a critical situation. "Dr. Haydock is with him now," she reported efficiently. "It came on quite suddenly after his afternoon refreshments. Severe palpitations, difficulty breathing, and a terrible grayish pallor." "What do you think brought it on?" Inspector Slack inquired. "I'm afraid Mr. Fielding has been rather agitated about this business with the mysterious lists. Despite my efforts to shield him from village gossip, word of Miss Trent's death and the appearance of his own name on those dreadful envelopes has quite unnerved him." Dr. Haydock emerged from the sick room at that moment, removing his stethoscope with the deliberate movements of a physician who has completed an unwelcome diagnosis. His expression was grave as he addressed the assembled group. "Digitalis poisoning," he announced without preamble. "Classic symptoms and rather more severe than one would expect from a simple miscalculation of prescribed dosage." "Poisoning?" Nurse Ferris's voice carried a note of professional outrage. "But that's impossible. I measure Mr. Fielding's medications with absolute precision. Every dose is calculated according to his weight and condition. I'm not suggesting deliberate error on your part, Dr. Haydock," said the physician, "but the symptoms are unmistakable, and the concentration in his system is significantly higher than his prescribed regimen would account for." Miss Marple, who had been listening to this exchange with her customary quiet attention, now spoke for the first time since arriving at the house. "Dr. Haydock, might it be possible to examine Mr. Fielding's refreshment service, the items he consumed immediately, before the onset of symptoms? Of course, though I should warn you that he's quite weak and may not be entirely coherent." They entered the morning room where Mr. Osric Fielding maintained his daytime residence, a cheerful chamber furnished with the sort of comfortable chairs and convenient tables that made an invalid's life tolerable. Fielding himself lay propped against cushions, his breathing labored but stable, his complexion having improved from the alarming gray that had characterized his collapse. "Visitors!" he wheezed, attempting a weak smile. "How kind, though I fear I'm not much company at present." Miss Marple approached his chair with a gentle manner she reserved for the elderly and infirm. "Mr. Fielding, I hope you won't mind if I ask about your afternoon routine. Dr. Haydock believes it might help determine what caused your illness." "My routine?" Fielding's eyes moved to the small table beside his chair, where the remnants of his afternoon refreshments remained undisturbed. "Just the usual, really. Tea at 2 with my orange marmalade. I'm rather particular about the timing, you know. Helps maintain some structure to the day." Miss Marple examined the tea service with the methodical attention of an expert cataloging evidence. The tray held a porcelain teacup with delicate blue patterns, a matching saucer, a small pot of marmalade, and a silver sugar bowl that appeared to have been recently used. "You take sugar in your tea, Mr. Fielding?" "Oh no, my dear lady, haven't for years. Diabetic condition, you understand. I use saccharine tablets instead. Much better for the constitution." But Miss Marple had already noted the 3 lumps of ordinary white sugar that sat, now somewhat stale, on the tea tray. She lifted the marmalade pot and observed that 2 distinct spoon tracks marked its contents, one shallow, one rather deeper. "Nurse Ferris," she said quietly, "could you tell me about Mr. Fielding's usual preference in marmalade? Does he typically consume it at 11 tross?" "11 tross?" Nurse Ferris looked puzzled. "Mr. Fielding takes his marmalade only with his afternoon tea. He's quite rigid about such matters." Miss Marple examined the teacup more closely, noting a faint grainy residue that clung to the rim despite the liquid having been consumed. The residue had a slightly bitter quality when she touched it delicately with her finger. "Inspector Slack," she said, "I believe you should preserve this tea service for analysis, particularly the cup and the marmalade pot." She moved to examine Nurse Ferris more closely, noting details that had previously escaped attention. The nurse's gloves, which she wore as a matter of professional habit, showed a tiny smear of orange substance on the right index finger. More interesting still was the faint black sheen that marked her fingertips, the same lustrous quality Miss Marple had observed on the raven feather found at the lich gate. "Nurse Ferris," she said conversationally, "do you happen to use linseed oil in your medical preparations? For maintaining the flexibility of leather medical equipment, perhaps?" Yes, occasionally. It's quite useful for preserving the suppleness of certain instruments and cases." Inspector Slack had been following Miss Marple's examination with growing interest. "Miss Marple, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," she replied, "that someone has been very clever about disguising the administration of a dangerous substance. Mr. Fielding's tea was doctored with digitalis, not in the tea itself, where the bitterness would be immediately apparent, but mixed with his marmalade to mask the taste. But Mr. Fielding says he doesn't take marmalade at 11 now. Precisely. But someone needed him to take it at exactly 11 har today, when his usual afternoon routine would provide the perfect alibi for what appeared to be an accidental overdose of his prescribed medication." Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. "The timing fits. If he consumed the doctored marmalade at 11, the symptoms would manifest around 2 or exactly when they did." Miss Marple turned to Nurse Ferris, whose professional composure was beginning to show distinct cracks. "The sugar lumps were added to encourage Mr. Fielding to consume more of the sweetened marmalade than usual, weren't they? And the deeper spoon. Track shows where additional marmalade was stirred in to ensure an adequate dose." "This is ridiculous," Nurse Ferris protested. "Mr. Fielding is confused about the timing. He often becomes muddled about when he's taken his refreshments." But Inspector Slack had been examining the evidence with increasing conviction. "Nurse Ferris, I think you'd better come with me to the station. There are several matters we need to discuss, regarding your previous employment and your relationship with Miss Trent's inquiries." As Nurse Ferris was led away, her professional mask finally slipping to reveal something much harder and more calculating beneath. Miss Marple remained in the morning room with Dr. Haydock and the recovering Mr. Fielding. "Will he be all right?" she asked quietly. "With proper care, yes. The dosage was significant but not fatal." "Thank heavens," Miss Marple nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "Dr. Haydock, I believe someone intended Mr. Fielding's death to appear as natural as possible. Perhaps a heart condition exacerbated by the stress of mysterious threats. And I suspect his will contains provisions that would benefit his devoted nurse quite considerably." A mercenary motive combined with desperation. "I think Miss Trent's inquiries were threatening to expose something in Nurse Ferris's past that would have ended her access to Mr. Fielding's estate. She needed to eliminate Miss Trent and secure her position before her deception was discovered." As they prepared to leave Fielding House, Miss Marple paused in the doorway, looking back at the scene of near tragedy. The elaborate performance with the ravens and envelopes was designed to create an atmosphere of supernatural threat, she mused. When Mr. Fielding died, it would seem like the fulfillment of some dark prophecy rather than calculated murder. Quite ingenious, really, if rather theatrical for my taste. Chapter 9. The List That Corrected Itself. Inspector Slack had taken considerable care in arranging the evidence upon the vicar's study table, laying out the 2 mysterious envelopes with the methodical precision of a man building a case that would need to withstand the scrutiny of magistrates and barristers. Miss Marple sat across from him, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked through a particularly intricate pattern while studying the documents with equal attention. "The spacing is identical," she observed, pausing in her work to lean forward slightly. "Look here, Inspector. The margins, the line heights, even the intervals between the names. These weren't typed independently. They follow exactly the same template. Inspector Slack examined the lists more closely, using a magnifying glass borrowed from Reverend Clement's desk. You're quite right. But on the second list, Miss Trent's name isn't simply crossed out or deleted. It's been omitted entirely, as though the list were retyped from scratch. Precisely. Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle rhythm. A conjurer's instinct for repetition without appearing to repeat. Mr. Holt's theatrical background is showing itself in the smallest details. You think Holt typed both lists? I think Mr. Holt provided the apparatus and the performance skills, while Nurse Ferris provided the motive and the detailed planning. A partnership of convenience, you might say. Inspector Slack made careful notes about the paper quality and typewriter characteristics before turning to examine the collection of evidence he had gathered from Holt's ironmongery. I've secured carbon papers from his back office, as you suggested. The impressions are quite revealing. He held up several sheets of dark carbon paper. Their surfaces bore the faint but unmistakable impressions of typewriter keys. Under careful examination, the ghost images of typed text became visible, repeated instances of the 5 names from the mysterious list. He practiced, Miss Marple said with satisfaction. Typed the names multiple times to ensure perfect alignment and spacing, rather more rehearsal than one would expect for a simple practical joke. And there's this. Inspector Slack produced a collection of string remnants he had found in Holt's shop, various lengths, some showing signs of having been pulled tight and then cut. One piece matches the groove pattern we found on Miss Trent's gas tap exactly. Miss Marple examined the string with the sort of concentrated attention she usually reserved for examining dropped stitches in her knitting. String is such a useful thing for someone with conjuring experience. It can be looped, pulled, and removed without leaving obvious traces. Perfect for operating mechanisms from a distance. The mechanics of miscreant murder, you mean? Indeed. A piece of string looped around the gas tap, extending perhaps to an open window, or even outside the cottage entirely. A simple pull would turn the gas on at the desired moment, and another sharp tug would remove the evidence entirely. Inspector Slack spread out additional evidence on the table, receipts, correspondence, and small personal items that painted a picture of the relationship between Holt and Nurse Ferris. I found these in Holt's desk drawer, he announced, producing several small checks made out to Digby Holt and signed by Ruth Ferris. Marked surgical sundries in the memo line, but the amount seemed rather generous for ordinary medical supplies. Payment? For services rendered, Miss Marple suggested, though I suspect the services had little to do with legitimate medical equipment. There's also this. Slack held up several sheets of typing paper that showed repeated attempts at reproducing the characteristic flaws of the shop's Remington typewriter. Practice sheets with particular attention to getting that raised R and weak O exactly right, Miss. Marple sat down her knitting and picked up one of the practice sheets. See how he's experimented with different levels of pressure. Someone who understands that the appearance of authenticity requires considerable behind-the-scenes preparation. What I still don't understand, Inspector Slack admitted, is why they needed such an elaborate performance at all. Why not simply murder Miss Trent and Mr. Fielding without all this business with ravens and mysterious lists? Because, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, they needed to create a climate of supernatural dread that would discourage close investigation. When people believe in curses and prophecies, they're less likely to look for rational explanations. The deaths would seem fated rather than calculated. She rose from her chair and moved to the window, where she could observe the lich gate in the distance. Moreover, the theatrical nature of the delivery method provided alibis for the actual perpetrators. While everyone was focused on mysterious birds and dramatic envelopes, the real work of murder was being carried out through much more mundane means: gas taps and doctored marmalade. Exactly. Methods that would appear accidental or natural, especially if the victims were already perceived as being under some sort of supernatural threat. Inspector Slack gathered the evidence back into neat piles. There's still the question of Nurse Ferris's specific motive. We know Miss Trent was making inquiries about her past, but what exactly was she hoping to discover? I suspect, said Miss Marple, returning to her chair, that Miss Trent recognized Nurse Ferris as someone she had encountered in a previous professional context. Perhaps someone who had left nursing under questionable circumstances. And the inquiries to St. Luke's Hospital would have confirmed that Ruth Ferris was actually Ruth Fenner, a probationer nurse who was dismissed after a suspicious incident involving sleeping drafts. The sort of past that would certainly disqualify someone from caring for a wealthy invalid with testamentary intentions. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, but her attention remained focused on the larger pattern that was emerging from their investigation. Nurse Ferris needed to eliminate Miss Trent before her past was exposed, and she needed to secure her position with Mr. Fielding before any questions could be raised about her qualifications. The mysterious death list provided the perfect cover for both objectives, by making the death seem supernatural rather than calculated, and by providing a convenient explanation for any future accidents that might befall the remaining people on the list. Once a climate of fear was established, subsequent deaths would be seen as fulfillments of prophecy rather than opportunities for investigation. Inspector Slack made final notes in his official report before closing the folder. A partnership between theatrical skill and medical access. Holt provided the performance and the apparatus, while Ferris provided the knowledge and opportunity for actual murder, and both provided alibis for each other during the crucial moments. Miss Marple added, Holt was demonstrating his trained raven to curious villagers while Ferris was attending to her patient's medical needs. Perfect respectability concealing carefully orchestrated murder. As they prepared to conclude their examination of the evidence, Miss Marple reflected on the curious psychology that had driven this elaborate deception. It's rather sad, really, she observed. Two people with genuine talents, Mr. Holt's skill with animals and performance, Nurse Ferris's medical training, choosing to use those abilities for such destructive purposes. Do you think they would have continued if we hadn't uncovered their scheme? Miss Marple considered this carefully. I believe they would have worked through the entire list, one by one, until suspicion was too dangerous to risk. A methodical elimination of anyone who might pose a threat to their plans. She folded her knitting and placed it carefully in her bag. Thank goodness for the small inconsistencies that betrayed them. The envelope that appeared at the wrong time. The marmalade consumed at 11 instead of 2. The linseed oil that connected theatrical bird preparation to medical equipment maintenance. The devil, as they say, is in the details. Indeed, Inspector. And it's often the smallest details that reveal the largest deceptions. Chapter 10. Even the bird that never carried anything. The vestry of St. Mary's had taken on the quality of a courtroom, as the small assembly gathered after evensong to hear Miss Marple's final exposition of the curious case that had begun, with a raven on the lich gate. The evening light filtered through the stained-glass windows, casting patterns of red and gold across the ancient stone walls where Inspector Slack had arranged his evidence with judicial precision. Present were the Reverend and Mrs. Clement, Lady Bantry, Dr. Haydock, and several other village worthies who had found themselves drawn into the web of mystery that had claimed Miss Phyllis Trent's life and nearly cost Mr. Fielding his own. The atmosphere was that peculiar mixture of solemnity and fascination that accompanies the resolution of matters that have disturbed the peaceful routine of village life. Miss Marple sat quietly in her accustomed chair, her hands folded over her knitting bag, waiting for Inspector Slack to complete his official presentation before offering her own observations. She had learned through long experience that official procedures must be properly observed before unofficial wisdom could be shared. "Ladies and gentlemen," Inspector Slack began, consulting his notes with bureaucratic thoroughness, "I can now provide you with the complete solution to the events that have troubled our community these past few days." He gestured toward the evidence displayed upon the vestry table. "The key to understanding this case lies in recognizing that we were never dealing with supernatural phenomena or mysterious prophecies. We were witnessing a carefully orchestrated performance designed to conceal premeditated murder." Mrs. Clement crossed herself reflexively. "But the raven, Inspector. Surely that great black creature appearing with those dreadful lists was more than mere coincidence." "The raven," said Miss Marple gently, "never brought anything at all. That magnificent bird was simply following his learned routine, responding to whistle calls and arriving for his regular feeding schedule. The envelopes were placed by human hands using very earthly methods." She rose and approached the table, where the physical evidence lay displayed. "You see, the envelopes were tacked beneath the Lichgate crossbeam beforehand. The small holes in the paper flaps show where pins or tacks secured them in place. Soot was smeared on the beam to attract the raven at the appropriate moment, creating the illusion that the bird had delivered the mysterious messages." Inspector Slack took up the narrative. Mr. Digby Holt, with his music hall background and skill in training animals, provided the theatrical apparatus. His trained raven, responding to whistle calls, would arrive punctually to provide dramatic emphasis for the discovery of envelopes that had been positioned in advance. "But why?" asked Reverend Clement. "What could anyone hope to accomplish with such elaborate deception?" Miss Trent had recognized Nurse Ruth Ferris as someone from her past, Miss Marple explained. Specifically as Ruth Fenner, a probationer nurse who had been dismissed from St. Luke's Hospital following a suspicious incident with sleeping drafts. Miss Trent's inquiries threatened to expose this deception and end Nurse Ferris's access to Mr. Fielding's considerable estate. Lady Bantry leaned forward with interest. "So Miss Trent was murdered to prevent this exposure." "Indeed, but the method was carefully chosen to appear accidental. Miss Trent's gas stove was turned on remotely using a length of string looped around the tap, a technique that allowed the perpetrator to be elsewhere when the accident occurred. The string was then removed by a sharp pull, leaving no obvious evidence of tampering." Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. "And Mr. Fielding's near-fatal dose of digitalis, administered through his morning marmalade, masked with extra sugar to encourage consumption and disguise the bitter taste. The timing was calculated so that Nurse Ferris would be performing her regular duties when the symptoms appeared, providing her with a perfect alibi." Miss Marple returned to her chair, her expression thoughtful. The genius of the scheme lay in its creation of a supernatural atmosphere that would discourage rational investigation. When people believe in curses and prophetic birds, they're less likely to look for logical explanations. The deaths would seem fated rather than calculated. "The partnership between Holt and Ferris was one of mutual convenience," Inspector Slack continued. "She provided medical access and knowledge of her victims' routines, while he supplied theatrical expertise and the trained raven that made the whole performance convincing." "What gave them away?" asked Mrs. Clement. Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Several small inconsistencies that accumulated into certainty. The second envelope appeared at the wrong time, 11 instead of 10, narned when the raven was trained to appear. The linseed oil used to give the raven's feathers theatrical sheen was found on Nurse Ferris's gloves. The fish glue used to seal the intercepted letter to St. Luke's Hospital came from the same source as the adhesive on the Lichgate envelopes. Most tellingly, she continued, the typing on both mysterious lists showed identical spacing and formatting, indicating they were prepared from the same template rather than created independently. A conjurer's instinct for precise repetition betrayed the theatrical nature of the entire enterprise. Inspector Slack concluded his official summary. Ruth Ferris has been charged with the murder of Miss Phyllis Trent and the attempted murder of Mr. Osric Fielding. Digby Holt faces charges as an accessory and for conspiracy in both crimes. As the formal proceedings concluded, the small assembly began to disperse into the gathering dusk. Miss Marple lingered in the vestry, drawn to the window that looked out over the churchyard where the whole strange business had begun. Lady Bantry joined her there, following her gaze toward the Lichgate, where King Jack had provided such convincing theatrical support for his human accomplices. I shall never again credit a bird with correspondence, Dolly declared with characteristic firmness. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with gentle amusement. Birds, my dear, are very innocent creatures. They follow their instincts and their training with admirable consistency. It is people who whistle and choose who is to read what the envelope says. She gathered her knitting bag and prepared to leave the ancient vestry where so much human drama had been laid bare. Mr. Holt's raven will continue to respond to whistle calls and arrive punctually for his meals. The bird has played no conscious part in these tragic events. He was simply being a raven, following the routines that human hands had taught him. They walked together through the churchyard. Miss Marple reflected on the curious mixture of theatrical skill and murderous intent that had nearly succeeded in its deadly purpose. It's rather instructive, really, she observed. The most elaborate deceptions often depend upon the simplest human assumptions. People see what they expect to see, and when that expectation is carefully managed by someone with theatrical training, the results can be quite convincing. Even when they involve trained ravens and mysterious prophecies, especially then, my dear Dolly, the more extraordinary the phenomenon appears, the less likely people are to look for ordinary explanations. They paused at the Lichgate, where the whole mystery had begun, now peaceful in the evening light. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, King Jack roosted in the church tower, innocent of any knowledge of the human drama that had swirled around, his simple responses to whistle calls and scattered grain. After all, Miss Marple concluded quietly, the most dangerous performances are often those that appear to be beyond human capability, and the most successful murderers are frequently those who convince their audience that they're witnessing acts of God rather than carefully planned acts of man.